Welcome to the secret source of innovation. We are glad you've tuned in. We have recorded some of our episodes with English-speaking guests, like this one. We hope you enjoy listening as usual.
Hello and welcome to the Secret Source of Innovation podcast, where we explore strategies, insights, and stories from the world's leading innovation leaders. Today, we have an exceptional guest joining us, Dr. Thibault Geoui. Thibault is a seasoned expert in data-driven innovation with a career that spans academic research, corporate leadership, and cutting-edge work in AI-driven drug development. After earning his PhD, Thibault transitioned from the academic path to the corporate world, where he's been able to combine his passion for exploration and science with a broader perspective, geographically as well as professionally. He's currently at the forefront of leveraging AI in the pharmaceutical industry, helping to tackle some of the most pressing challenges in drug development, and hosts the Tech and Drugs podcast himself, which I find quite cool. Today, we talk about his journey, the role of AI in reshaping pharmaceutical industry and healthcare, and what innovation means to him. So, Thibault, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for joining, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Well, Giordano, thanks for having me today, and I'm sure it's going to be a very fun
Before
discussion.
we dive into the big topics of AI and drug development, etc., maybe a couple of more personal questions at the beginning. So, who or what inspired you to pursue a career in science and innovation?
So, for as long as I can remember, I've always been, fascinated by science. I think like a lot of kids, I liked dinosaurs. I was born in France, in the French Alps, so on the border with Switzerland, very close to Geneva, surrounded by mountains. And one of my hobby when I was a kid was fossil hunting. So I still have, or my parents have somewhere in their attic, a bunch of the things that we found. I remember finding actually, a fossilized fish, and I can't find it, and I'm very sad that I can't find it because that was one of my biggest finds as a kid. So yeah, it really started there. So I was fascinated by that as I grew up. I liked all sorts of sciences, but I started to be more and more interested in biology. I really like to understand how things work. Go into the details. I didn't like when people say, "Oh, it's just like that." So my mother keeps reminding me that when she was telling me, when I was asking a question and she was telling me, "Oh, that's just how it is," I was like, "Well, that's not an answer. I want to understand." And as I grew up, so to your point, who inspired me? I think as I got older, there were like the typical scientists that inspired everyone, like Einstein, because of like the thing that he was able to think about are so mind-bending. Like how can you reimagine concept that feels to have, that people don't even think about, and is completely changing the way we think about the world that surrounds us. Marie Curie, of course, for all the discovery that she made, plus as a woman in a time where it was like double difficult to do it when you were a woman, and she got 2 Nobel Prize. Moving on, a number of other scientists that made important discovery in the field that I will end up choosing, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. I worked in structural biology, and in structural biology, we have a lot of people who worked on topics that where people told them, don't work on that, it's never going to work. So I hope I will get the name right, but there was a guy who ended up getting a Nobel Prize. I think his name was McKinnon, who worked at the Rockefeller Institute. So he had an initial training, but then really wanted to solve a very complex problem. And I think he had a tenure track, so don't quote me on that. I mean, I know it's recorded, so yes, you can quote me. And people were telling him, don't go after this problem because it's going to fail. So I think he left his full-time job, went again to train almost as a student, then worked on this topic, solved the problem, and then got a Nobel Prize. And I think this kind of story are amazing because it tells you so much about people who are so fascinated by a problem that no matter how difficult the problem is, they want to solve it. And I find this inspiring.
Mm-hmm. And why did you then finally switch from academia to the corporate world? So what was the reason behind that? It's pretty similar to what I did probably, but might be
So
interesting.
So I did my PhD in structural biology in France. So I was in Grenoble, and structural. First of all, structural biology is beautiful. So structural biology essentially it's a set of tools that you are using to probe the matter, to see things that are so small that a normal light microscope cannot see. So you will use things like electron microscopy, or in my case, it's X-ray crystallography. So you need to grow crystals, put them in front of an X-ray. So it's a bit like the X-ray that you have when you go to the doctor, except that it's a very, very big instrument. It's a kilometer in diameter, and it throws very, very powerful X-ray. And as I said, it does it on crystal. And crystal is not necessarily the normal shape of the matter, when it comes to protein. So, proteins essentially are those tiny factories that we have inside our cells that are responsible for a lot of the reaction, a lot of the inner working of a cell. But if you want to see them, they are so small that you can't put them in front of a normal microscope. So you have to put them in conditions where they will assemble in a repetitive pattern, which is a crystal. And as you do that, then you can use them, put them in front of an X-ray beam, and then collect information that will help you solve the three-dimensional structure. I loved it because I thought it was beautiful. It was important because you could really understand the relationship between the shape of something and how it works. But the process, I loved the science. I didn't like the process to get there, because the process to get there will be sometimes years of doing the same thing. So essentially, in this case, you will sample several thousand different conditions. You will mix a drop, like a microliter drop of your protein solution with a microliter drop of chemicals that you use to force the protein to go out of the solution and in a crystal. And you do it over and over and over. And I've done that for 4 years. And you need to be very tolerant to failure because it fails all the time. And what I found a little bit frustrating in the academic environment is that the fact that I will work on similar topic for an extended amount of time. I think also I've done my PhD in a very well-founded environment, and I realized also pretty quickly that this environment where I've done my PhD in Grenoble, where we had all those fantastic instruments, a lot of funding, as I said, was not necessarily the normal standard environment to do academic research in Europe. And I was like, okay, I want to see more diversity. I want to have more projects. I want things to, to have different variety of projects. And I thought, okay, how do I do that and still stay connected to science? So I decided, okay, I'm going to go in the corporate world. And let's be honest, I had no clue what I could do in the corporate world. I mean, I thought, okay, the initial thing was, well, I can be a scientist in the corporate world, but I'm pretty sure we'll have some of the similar challenges that I had in academia. So I was starting to look into alternative careers. And I worked at the time in the lab with products from a company called Kajen. I like their products. And I was like, oh, I'm going to send them a CV. That was a bit random, but then I ended up getting a job and I started my career there as a product manager, where essentially I developed the tools that I was using in the lab. So I thought, well, it's great. I will help a lot of scientists with the tools that I'm developing.
Interesting. I mean, science is always or should be complex, right? On the other hand, the life science, and pharmaceutical research, etc., is probably even more complex and even more long-lasting and investment-heavy. Maybe we can start to somehow match our discussion with regard to the AI topic. So, how do you see the potential of the innovation process or the product development process in that industry when we now hit this trend of AI, maybe on a quite still high level, but what is your view on that?
Yeah. Okay, so I think we need to step back a little bit, and as you said, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most complex industry from a research standpoint, but also one of the most research intensive, which makes it very very fun and very interesting. And I think also one more thing to add is that what we are trying to solve and the mission is also another thing that attracted to me, because in the end we develop drugs to treat patients. And you have to see, depending on how you count, people will say you have between 10,000 and 30,000 different diseases. There are, I think, 3,000 to 5,000 drugs on the market, but a lot of those drugs treat the same diseases. And last time I checked, if you look at drugs that cure a disease, a unique disease, I think it's 200 to 400. So a lot of the other drugs on the market are actually addressing the symptoms of a disease, but not curative. So it means that you still have over 20,000 diseases that that don't really have good treatment. And I think this is what we always have to keep in mind, because at the end of the day, this is a problem that we are trying to solve. We are trying to help patients. We are trying to help people live a healthier life and bring them better drugs. Now, if we look at the track record of the pharmaceutical industry, so of course now, like the lifespan, the healthy lifespan of human during the 20th century has increased dramatically, and it's much better than it was 100 years ago. But what we see today is that we are not very good actually at releasing new drugs. And if you compare the cost of developing a drugs in the 1950s compared to today, so essentially the cost as measured by how many billion did we invest in R&D to launch a drug. Mm-hmm. Today, it's 100 times more expensive than what it was in the 1950s. And this is adjusted by inflation, by the way. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it takes on average 10 to 12 years to launch a drug. It costs, depending on how you count, 2 to 6 billion. And we fail 95% of the time. So these are the headline metrics of drug R&D. So it's pretty terrible. I mean, there is not a lot of industry where when you start a project, you say, in 95% of the case, I will fail this project, but I will still spend a couple of billion on this project. So we can do better, and we should do better for the patient. Now, if there are a lot of authors who look into R&D efficiency to try to better understand why we are not doing better. And there is one author that I really like. His name is Jack Scannell, and I can send you some reference that you can attach to a podcast when it's released. And he had a number of explanations why we are not doing so well. But one of them was something that we call brute force. And brute force essentially means that in pharma R&D, we tend to develop a lot of tools that are going after a problem, with very heavy artillery. So, you will have automation. So instead of doing, like small experiment, manually, you do 10,000 times more and faster experiments. So you generate a lot of data. Then you have things like genome sequencing. Now compared to 15 or 20 years ago, we do it 1 billion times faster and 1 billion times cheaper. So we can sequence a lot of genomes. In chemistry, there is this tool that was invented in the 80s, combinatorial chemistry. And in 1 year, chemists can do 800 times more chemical compounds now than they could before they had access to combinatorial chemistry. And there are hundreds more examples. Why am I saying that? Is that we develop all those tools that are doing a lot of experiment, that are creating tons of data, but we are not very good at then taking all this data, integrating all this data, making sense of them, doing correlation to draw conclusion. Because in the end, the pharmaceutical industry, it's an information problem. It's really about taking some information to draw conclusion and eventually, develop a drug that address a certain disease. And there are thousands of steps in this process. And from one step to the other, we need to be able to inform the next step with information from the previous steps. And the pharmaceutical industry is full of silos. So as we are optimizing the use of information in some of the silos, we're not necessarily very good at transferring that to the next step. No, so now back to your question, AI. I mean, there is obviously a lot of hype around AI today, and I'm certainly a big fan of what's happening in AI. But we need to be also realistic. So we'll certainly talk about that. But I believe one of the core, the core benefit of AI tools is this ability to take a lot of data and make sense of a lot of data, to take a lot of disparate data and analyze it in a way that previously was a little bit difficult or even impossible with some of the tools that we had previously. So in a nutshell, that's where I see the benefit of AI, and I'm sure we'll go into some more details.
So it's really, as you said, along the entire product development process. And maybe we can go deeper in a couple of minutes, but it's really the understanding that in many, many parts, data aggregation, insight, patient data, whatever, even material research, text counting, whatever, right? So there are many, many of different use cases where this technology may help to finally fasten the process, right? So that's the main conclusion, in order to invest more resources and capabilities to explore, other diseases and bring drugs to the market, right? So that's a bit your position here.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's if we look at all those use cases, there are ways of thinking about those use cases differently, of using all the data that we've generated and draw conclusion from those data, to look into historical data as well, and recover information that we had under our nose, but we were not able to discover. As you said, I also have my own podcast, and it's very new. I just released, today, actually half an hour ago, the third episode. But in the second episode, I was talking to someone. So his name is Ben Silegi, who worked for Roche for many years. And he said at Roche, at some point when they started their digital transformation journey, they looked into some of the data that they had accumulated for many years. And as they looked into those data, they were able to observe signal, biomarkers that they had but that they were not able to find in the past because they didn't necessarily have the right tools or didn't really focus on this problem. But then they said, oh, we have all those data, and in those data, there might be things that are very important for our drug development process that will benefit the patient. And we need to, we need to be able to have a mechanism to reanalyze the data and to have a process so that whenever we have this data, we don't miss critical information. And I really think that this is the key point. I mean, if there is one message that I want to drive, is that AI will help us find information that we couldn't find in the past.
Mm-hmm. And how do you look at the patient studies? From my experience, and I'm not a life science expert, of course, I have the feeling that those patient studies are always taking so long and are so complex. Do you see a value in there?
Yeah,
to scale it somehow, or
definitely. So if you look at, if I were to really, really overly simplify the drug discovery and development process, so you have like three blocks. So you have the start. The start is what we call early discovery and preclinical. So essentially, it's anything that happens before you go into human, and this is where a lot of the hardcore science happen. And you can say even before that, there is a lot of the academic research that is happening that sometimes is not even connected to a disease, because they focus on really on understanding cellular processes, and eventually they realize, oh, the cellular processes is connected to a disease. And often this is where we transition to, okay, if we understand that this is connected to a disease, maybe we can develop a drug against that. So there is that. In academia, it can last for 10, 20 years. Then it goes to like the pharma process. And again, I'm overly simplifying, where so you have a disease, you identify a target, then you will develop something to modulate this target. So it can be a small chemical molecule, it can be an antibody, it can be a piece of RNA, for instance, lots of different stuff. Then once you have that, you need to make sure that it works in an organism, because a drug is not just like a a small compound in the test tube. It needs to work in an organism, and the drug does something to the organism, but the organism also does something to the drug. So if you ingest a pill, like it needs to go through your digestive system. It will be digested in bits and pieces. Then it needs to reach, the target, which is difficult. So you need to check for that. So that's the first step. Then the second step is when you move from this kind of early stage to the stage where you move to human, and you have different clinical phase. And the clinical phase, essentially, their goal is to check that anything that you observed in vitro and in vivo, in animal in vivo, that it actually translates to human. Because very often things that happen in a certain way in animal don't really translate well in human. So you want to make sure that there is no toxicity and that there is also efficacy, essentially that the drug does what it's supposed to do. And then you do that on, you start with healthy subjects, then you move to patients, to a small group of patients, then you move to a much larger group. And these are the different stages of a clinical trial. And in many ways, this part is more, almost more logistics. So it's a mix of a scientific and a logistics problem, because the bigger problem in clinical trials is the coordination. So finding the patient, coordinating the different centers, making sure that the patient and the team at those different locations stick to what was agreed, so that we can make sound comparison at the end. And again, I'm by no means an expert in the clinical phases. I'm more of an expert in the earlier phase, but this is really what it is. So it's coordinating a very highly complex study in multiple sites. And if you think about it as a supply chain problem, AI has been applied to supply chain problem in many in many industries. So you can definitely do some optimization of how do you design the trial, how do you select your patient, how do you define what is the best endpoint, so the thing that you want to measure, etc., etc. So that's the middle phase. And then the last phase is actually when you commercialize the drug. And then when you commercialize the drug, by definition, you're not in a control environment anymore. So when you do your trial, you will have a very clear definition of who's your perfect patient, what are the criteria that they need to fulfill. When you're in the wild, when you're commercializing the drug, then by definition you will have several order of magnitudes more people taking your drugs with more genetic diversity. And this is where you might also want to have ways to, actually it's not that you might want, you have to have ways to see if there are any adverse events that are reported or anything that you could not observe during your clinical trial. So there are adverse events that are very rare sometimes, 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000. And of course, you cannot see that in your clinical trial, because your clinical trial will be several thousand, but not several hundreds of thousands. And you need to be able to detect this very small signal from multiple sources. And here again, artificial intelligence can be used to help you detect this difficult to find signal.
And do you have numbers already somewhere estimating how much efficiency gains might be achievable in such a process? So are we talking about, I don't know, 20% less, 30% less, or what is the benchmark?
You mean by using AI?
Yeah, in the entire process.
Okay. Great question. We don't know yet, but I'll still give you some numbers. So if there was a paper published by the Boston Consulting Group, I don't know, I think it was in Nature. I'll find the paper, I'll send you the link, that shows how many AI developed drugs are in clinical trials today and have been launched. And as far as I remember, I think it's 60 in 2023. I think there was 67 drugs in clinical trial phase, 1, 2, 3, and launched. That came from an AI pipeline. Even one was launched. So now the devil is in the detail, because this paper triggers so much discussion online, because the question was, well, what does it mean to be an AI developed drug? And there are, I think, as many answers as people you will ask. I think every company in the world at the moment is using some AI somewhere in their workflow. Now, as I said, drug discovery and development, it's thousands of different steps. So any company will have one step where there is an algorithm that helps, go left or right, depending on the input. Does it mean that the drug was developed using AI? Well, a little bit was done to develop the drug using AI, but I wouldn't call this an AI developed drug. I think what we should call AI developed drug is when companies are using an end-to-end platform, from the very early stage to inform all the stage gate process, all the very important decision, and then where you clearly see a lot of value has been added by this platform to the process. If you look at it like that, then it's I'm not sure we have really 67 drugs. I haven't done the analysis, but that's an analysis that would be worth doing. Now there are definitely a few companies that fit this criteria, that have really AI platform, end-to-end AI platform that they combine also with robotics, because being able to produce a lot of data is very important, because the data will feed into your algorithm, will improve the algorithm, and have this thing that we call lab in the loop, where essentially you start in silico, you ask a question, then it tells you, okay, you should do this or that, then you do it in the lab, generate the data, and then feed the data back into the algorithm. So to go back to your question, if we look into those companies that have those AI platform, currently there is no drug, that was fully developed by an AI platform. However, there are drugs that reach the clinical phase, and now we are talking reaching clinical phase 1 and clinical phase 2. So we can already see how fast they reach those clinical phase. So the earlier phase that I talked about earlier on, discovery and preclinical, typically in the normal process take 5 to 6 years. And if you take a company like in silico medicine, they do it in 18 months or less. So it's much faster. It's it's less than half of the time, and in some cases, I think they even reported one that they did in less than 10 months. And even in some cases, there are other companies that did that also quite quickly and reached the clinical phase and failed in the clinical phase. So you will say, oh, that's not great. But keep in mind that in the traditional process, you fail almost all the time. So people fail after 5 or 6 years of work. So it's better to fail after 18 months than to fail after 5 or 6 years. Obviously, the demonstration that this approach is superior to the traditional pharma approach will be when we start to have a significant number of drugs that went through this process that are actually launched. And that will take another couple of years.
Interesting. Yeah. So I could imagine how much potential we can reveal in the future to really then focus maybe on rare diseases, focus on more personalized drug developments. I mean, the entire differentiation between male and female medication. So there's so many discussions and innovation areas still open. So good to understand that. Maybe in another question, a bit more regarding the somehow competitive landscape. So do you think that the big incumbents, so the old pharma giants, are better prepared to do that? Maybe not at the beginning, but they can scale easily? Or is it something where I would now call them AI-born pharmaceutical companies have an advantage?
So the AI-born, actually, they have a name now. So I think in the past we called them pharma tech, but now tech bio. So tech bio is the name that we give to those companies that are almost started as a software company with the main use case being drug discovery and development. And there are hundreds of them at the moment, those small companies. So I think it's like in any of those rapid expansion phase, you have hundreds of companies, and maybe 10 will survive. There will be a lot of consolidation, and we'll start to see like the next wave of pharma giant will certainly come from that. But to your question, are the incumbent, are the traditional pharma well prepared? That's a tough question, because pharma is so complex, and they are big super tankers. So changing the way they do things is very, very hard. Now, if you look at, I think the best example of one of a company doing all the right thing is Roche. So there is a consulting company, I think, called CB Insight, that put together a leaderboard of what are the best prepared pharma company for AI and regarding the digital transformation. So Roche has invested massively in its AI transformation. 2 years ago, the CFO of Roche gave a presentation during an investor day where they talked about the investment they made and the transformation they made. And it's interesting because they revealed some figures, and they said we spent already 2.5 billion in our digital transformation. And they also had a very interesting slide because they were showing how they reorganized themselves to be better prepared to leverage AI tools. And they were showing a slide where they had 4 separate entities. I can't remember exactly which entity it was, but I think different departments that were working in silos. And essentially, they said we broke the silos, we brought the organization together. Now we have, instead of having blocks, vertical blocks, we have layers where the data is flowing much more freely from one side of the organization to the other. They build microservices on top of it, so they think more like a software company. They really build the foundation, the data foundation, the tools foundation, the organization foundation to enable a better use of data and to enable better use of digital tools. If you look at one of their subsidiaries, so Genentech belong to Roche, they also hire a researcher called Aviv Regev. And Aviv Regev she's a pioneer of the concept of lab in the loop that I was talking about earlier, where essentially you start your experiment in silico, you inform scientists saying, okay, this should be your next experiment, and that's what we expect in terms of outcome. You perform the experiment, you generate data, you feed them back into your model, and you iterate until you reach what you want. And as you're generating data, you make sure also that those data are easy to consume by AI model for someone else that will do another experiment that you don't even know they will do, but you need to make sure that your data are ready for that. But Roche, I don't know how many there are, maybe 50, 80,000 people. So imagine the challenge of doing that in such a large organization that has potentially hundreds of different sites that come also from acquisition with all the complexity. So to answer your question, I think something that I know a lot of all the large pharma are investing in their digital transformation. They are all very publicly saying that they are going all in on AI. They are hiring chief AI officer, chief digital officer, chief transformation officer. And they have some success, but it's challenging. And what we see now is also a lot of partnership between the large pharma and the tech bios.
Exactly. That would have been my hypothesis, that especially in the early phases, it might make sense for a tech bio to start, right, and explore and be faster, and then maybe later on be sold or acquired or whatever, hand that over, and then let the big giants do the clinical trials, etc. Right? Would that be maybe a good logic?
I think that's kind of the model that pharma has done for many years. Before tech bio, they were doing that with biotech. So a lot of the large pharma, their key competency will be, what is the best asset to acquire that we can take further, and this stage that we discussed before, the clinical stage, is very capital intensive. So a small company can't do it they can't do it on their own anyway. So even a tech bio that has like great platform, great tech, who is able to develop fantastic candidates, at this timing point, they don't have the scale to do a clinical trial. So they will have to partner. They will have either to partner or to sell their asset to a larger company. If you look at it from the large pharma company side, a lot of them are still in this phase where they are doing a bit of soul searching, saying, we want to experiment, so we want to do POC. And a lot of them are stuck in this constant POC mode where they are trying things, but going to the next phase, saying, hey, we tried it, we like it, we implement it. That we haven't seen yet at scale, being able to really say, okay, now we have all those processes as part of our our normal way of operating. So I'm not really answering your question here. Who will win? How things will work? I think it's as usual. It will be a mix thing. So we'll certainly see tech bios scaling and starting to grow. I mean, we also already started to see some acquisitions. So, for instance, there is a very successful tech bio called Recursion Pharmaceutical from the US, who bought, I think it was last year or 18 months ago, Exscientia, a UK-based company, and Valence Lab. So they already started to acquire a bunch of companies, and they are growing. They are getting a lot of competencies from those different companies. In parallel, we see large companies, large pharma, such as Roche, Novartis, et cetera, partnering with tech bios. Another trend that is very interesting is that we start to see the GAFAM, so, like the Google, the Facebook, the Amazon, investing heavily in life science. There was a presentation from Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's CEO, very recently, who talked about an era where biology is becoming an engineering problem. It might be a little bit of a simplification, but I find this fascinating because, there is some truth. And I think what I like even more is that it's attracting attention to a very important problem. And a lot of people who would not necessarily think about a career in life science or healthcare are now thinking, oh, I'm an engineer, or I'm a developer. Hey, why not focusing on that? So you know what? If you look at any of the GAFAM, if they wanted to buy a pharma company, they could.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised that it didn't happen yet.
Yeah, good example. What I observe from my outside industry perspective is that the pharmaceutical companies I know a bit better. Yeah? For example, I recorded a podcast last week with Tatjana from Merck, that those companies have paid much more attention towards organizing their data in the past than other industries. So my feeling is, compared to other industries like automotive or FMCG or whatever, the pharmaceutical companies were much better in organizing their data, and it's now easier to leverage AI. So at least that was my observation compared to other industries. Maybe still within it's different, but
yeah. So are they good at organizing data? To be honest, I haven't seen the inside of every single pharmaceutical company, but I worked in and with a lot of them. And when you start to open the box, very often it doesn't look very good. So I can give you a few anecdotes. I worked with a company where I was asking them, can I get my hands on certain type of data? And they were telling me, oh, if you want, we can ship them to you. And I'm like, what do you mean ship? Like, yeah, it's printed. Okay. Then another time I was asking someone who was doing an experiment that generates tons of data. I was asking him, what do you do with the data once you're done? And he's like, we can't keep the data because the cloud is full. And I was like, what does it mean the cloud is full? So the cloud is never full. Maybe we don't pay enough, or we don't have a strategy for storing this kind of data, but the cloud is not full. And then I was looking at historical data, was working with a company that had 50 years worth of data. And if you were going more than 5-6 years, you couldn't make any sense of the data. So I know that a lot of pharmaceutical companies have invested massively into getting their historical data, cleaning their historical data. I'm afraid that sometimes they do it also at the expense of making sure that their new data is future-proof. And if you look at how much data is being produced every year, it's really an exponential. So I think I read somewhere that in the next 3 years, we will produce more data than what humanity has produced ever since we started to produce data. So what it tells me is that it's great to look into all the data that have been produced, but make sure that your new data, the data that you're producing today, is done in such a way that it's easy to consume from an AI standpoint. And what does it mean? It means that you need to label the data, you need to clean the data, you need to have all the metadata, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with this concept of fair data, findable, accessible. I'm always missing the other letter in the acronym. Interoperable and I'll find it. But then, yeah, a lot of organization are still not very familiar with that. And I think when you look into the pharmaceutical organization, and I'm not very popular when I say that, but the pharmaceutical organization, they don't necessarily have a data culture. So they will tell you, oh, it's not true, we produce a lot of data. But when you look at it, the way pharma has operated for many, many years is that I have a scientific question, I do an experiment, I generate data, I answer my question. I eventually store my data somewhere because of regulatory requirement, but then I move on. So it's a very linear way of doing things. Whereas now, as I was saying, with a lab in the loop, you need to think about data as a reusable asset. So you produce data, or you start in silico, you have an algorithm that has been trained on data that informs you on what you need to do next. Then you produce data to improve the algorithm, and then those data are kept to be used also by someone else who will work on a different project that you don't know, but you need to make sure that the data are easily findable and consumable. And I don't think that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are very good at that. A lot of them are investing. A lot of them are doing their digital transformation to be able to address that. But if you were to put them, on a scale on how AI ready they are today, how much they invested, I think a lot of them would not be very high on this graph.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So a lot to do here. Maybe let's tackle a final topic. We pre-discussed it a bit in our preparation call. What I found quite interesting is that you mentioned that AI may not only change the pharmaceutical industry per se, or in this specific drug development, but may also disrupt even the entire healthcare industry, focusing more on preventative solutions. And you named also a couple of cool investors, for example, the co-founder of Spotify, you mentioned investing in solutions and services, ensuring that society becomes healthier at the end and doesn't need so much drugs and medicine at the end. So can you explore a bit how you see this trend and how?
Definitely. I mean, as you said, I think the best way to treat a disease is not to get a disease. I think more and more people are wearing, device like an Apple Watch or Fitbit or whatever that gives you certain information, blood rate, like the activity, the trends. I think the trend is the most important. Is there anything changing about you that you can't really notice? Because things happen on in a very long time scale. But if you're recording certain information on a very long time scale, what you can see is trend. Is the trend going up or is the trend going down? Am I getting healthier or is there something degrading that I don't even notice? There was a very interesting paper that was published, I think last year, that was showing that there are 2 time points in life where you can observe changes at the molecular level in your organism and things that have accumulated for many years. I think one of the time point was 44, and I'm 45, and I can definitely tell you that I felt it when I turned 44. And I think the other one is around 60 or 65, where you see changes. But those changes, they don't happen from one day to the other. It's an accumulation of things, but it's a bit like, when you're playing Jenga, this thing with blocks of wood. So you're accumulating them, and it gets bigger, 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 and then one day it all falls down. And that's, maybe it's an oversimplification, but it's kind of what happened in your organism. There are things. A disease very often is the result of an accumulation of a lot of things that you don't feel for a while, and then at some point, there is a tipping point, and things happen. But what if you could prevent this tipping point? What if you could see things happening and, and many years before something bad happens, you could treat it? There are diseases like diabetes or Alzheimer where we now know that it's the result of an accumulation of certain cellular process over decades. So imagine after 10 years, you see that something is going wrong, but you know that there is another 10 or 20 years before the disease manifests. Is there anything that you can do to your lifestyle, to the exercise, nutrition, or drugs to actually start to impact that? So as I said, I mean, we have a health tracker device, but then there are companies now that are taking that one step further. So of course, we all know about companies that were doing genetic testing. So you can have like your own genetic profile, but the genetic profile tells you, okay, this is what could happen. This is not what will happen, but or in some case, yes, it's what will happen. But in many cases, it tells you uh, if you do certain thing, there is 75% chances that this disease happens. But if you do some early intervention, this will not happen. So now imagine you combine this genetic profile, which is very personal, with longitudinal health tracking. The company that you were mentioning that was co-founded by the Spotify founder is called Neko Health. Neko Health is a company where they started in one of the Nordic countries. Now they are in the UK. You go to a clinic, they will take several hundreds of thousand measurements, the weight, lots of picture of your skin, many other parameters. And then you do that every 6 months or every 12 months. And then you accumulate lots of data lots of very granular data about your health. And then every time you go, you can get some trends on what's going on. So they released a scientific paper that was really interesting, where they showed that after 1 year of operation in the Nordic countries, they were able to prevent, I think, 1% of extremely serious health problem by sending someone to the hospital before they could feel that something bad was happening to them. So that for me is extremely powerful, because in general, healthcare is expensive and inefficient when the disease already happened. If you can intervene before the disease happened, this is where you can make big course correction. And as a society, I mean, it's good for the individual, but as a society, also think about the implication. I mean, healthcare is one of the most expensive spending in any country. Imagine if you could be, like 100 times more efficient by focusing on prevention instead of just focusing on cure.
Cool. That sounds to be a pretty cool research field for innovation. Thanks for sharing that. Maybe the last two questions. I know your LinkedIn game, which is pretty cool. And you're posting many insights and studies and quotes, etc. How do you stay up to date? Yeah, what are your sources of inspiration? Is there something you can share with the listeners which might be interesting? If they're interested
I think so. Yes, I'm spending, I think, too much time on LinkedIn, but I think it's great. For me, as I said, there are a few topics that I find very interesting. I like innovation, I like tech, and I like how innovation and tech are applied to healthcare and drug discovery and development. So the way I stay up to date is that I will follow maybe a dozen people who are really into let's call them influencer or key opinion leaders. And then every day I'll spend an hour or more seeing what are the latest news. I obviously get information from other sources, but so far I thought that LinkedIn gave me the type of information that I'm looking for. And you have a lot of people also doing pretty smart analysis. So in many ways, it's different from other social network in the sense that people go there for professional reason. So you might have less opinion-based things and more fact-based things. Although, I mean, that's not always true. But for me, that has been the best way, especially with what's happening around AI. I mean, you have all the experts on AI, like people who truly understand how you develop models. Jan LeCun, for instance, from Meta, the chief AI officer from Meta, is very often posting and showing what are the latest development from his team. If you want to know what are the latest interesting paper from the NeurIPS conference, where all the key opinion leaders in AI are presenting, you will get that on LinkedIn as well. So for me, LinkedIn has been really one way to stay on top of this extremely fast developing field. Last week, everyone was talking about DeepSeek, for instance, the new AI model from China. I've seen hundreds of posts on that. So now that also the other problem is that you're kind of flooded with information, and that can be a little bit overwhelming. But to me, it's been a place where I find most of the information I need to stay on top of things.
And what would you say is probably the biggest trend in 2025 in the area which we discussed today? So what are you expecting?
So if you had asked me in December, I would say agentic AI. So essentially, using an LLM to combine different AI models and getting your AI to do more sophisticated things for you. So I think yesterday or the day before, OpenAI launched their model. What was it? ChatGPT Research, something like that. So essentially, it's a new version that can do much more sophisticated research by combining different tools. So I think this is this concept that you don't have one model that will do everything for you, but you will have a collection of models that are orchestrated by one Uber model. And most probably this Uber model will have an interface with you that is an LLM so that you can chat with it and then ask it to do things from you. So that I think will be a big thing in 2025. But then at the beginning of the year, there was a presentation from NVIDIA CEO that I mentioned before, Jason Young, who talked also about physical AI. And the physical AI was this concept of using a digital world to train robots, to accelerate the training of robots so that when you put them in the physical world, then they have seen already millions of hours of environment where they are. And I think this combination of AI agent and robots that are trained. I mean, it feels like science fiction to talk about that, but we've been talking a year ago to companies that were developing robots to operate in the lab, and the lab is a very complex environment. There are lots of things that are where it's difficult to predict what will happen. So imagine if you could, instead of training the robot directly in the lab, you train them in a simulation of your lab, so that they see a lot of things that will very rarely happen. But if it happened in the physical world, they will have seen it in the simulation, and they will know how to react. And that, for me, is a fascinating concept. And I'm sure it will really accelerate the way we use robots. And we will certainly see more robots this year.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good one. So the final question, as always in our podcast, what's your secret sauce of innovation? How would you describe that?
For me, it's connection. So it's connecting things that are normally not connected. So if I really take my world, it's connecting the Uber subject matter expert in drug R&D with tech people, and getting those people who speak different language finally understanding each other, working on project together. Because people who come from different worlds, they have different ways of seeing a problem. And when you get them to work together, then this is where magic happens. So, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. For me, this is where the magic of diversity and inclusion happen. It's really where you get people from different background, different training, different culture. And I don't mean only culture from different country, but different culture from the training they went through to work together on a common problem. And I've seen beautiful things happening when you manage to do that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Thibault, for sharing your journey with us. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks, Giordano. And I hope people will like it and will send you lots of questions.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and feel free to recommend it to others. Follow our LinkedIn community, The Secret Source of Innovation, to make sure you don't miss any exciting episodes. In our regular podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, we discuss with innovation thought leaders how organizations and corporate culture can be shaped to be best prepared for future challenges, and where you should start today to make your product and service portfolio successful tomorrow.